From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joel Mitchell. How today, Joel?
I'm tired.
Yeah, you have seemed a bit tired this week. Yeah. What is that, you reckon?
Oh, it could be the overnight trip I did to New Zealand last week and the 24 hours of awakeness that I had. And I've got about, 12 hours of sleep that I need to still catch up on that was lost over that period of time.
You had the weekend, right?
Yeah, but I didn't get an extra 12 hours of sleep on the weekend.
Yeah. We discussed this, right? You're not a napper.
No, I'm not. No, unless I'm really, really sick. That's the only time I can nap, even when my son was a baby and was waking up sort of every 2 nights, or every 2 hours rather overnight. I still couldn't nap during the day. So, I envy our devs when they go off and take advantage of the nap room. I'm like, man, I wish I could nap, but I just can't.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to survive if I couldn't nap with how hectic our my home life is with the 3 kids and all their sporting activities and all the rest. So just need that on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon to make it through.
Yeah.
But I feel you. I did keep an eye on your flight and I noticed it was delayed. And I was like, oh, that's really sucks. Joel, that's a long day.
It was a long day because it was a 2 a.m. local time wake up for me as well that day. And then, by the time I got to bed, it was after 2 the next day. So,
but hopefully the effort was worthwhile, right? Helping New Zealand become the number 1 leader in the world for psych health and safety. It's it's a hard task, but someone's got to do it.
Yeah, no, it was. If it hadn't been a good reason, I would have probably pushed back a little bit on on that one. But no, it's it's an exciting thing to be piloting a program like that with a whole of government approach. So it's worth the effort.
Yeah, and good for you to empathise, I guess, with me as well. For it's not all fun and games when I go travelling.
I don't ever suggest that it's fun and games when you go travelling, do I?
It's probably my wife. She's like, oh, did you enjoy your holiday? I'm like, it really wasn't a holiday.
Yeah, no, I know what work travel's like. That's why I don't like to do it.
Yeah. One of my friends, he actually did the best thing he could, and he took his wife on like a 3-day trip to New York with him from Perth. So we're talking about a 12-hour time difference, because his wife always said the same as my wife does, and was like, hey, you're living it up, you're going to all these lounges and everything. And then she's like, oh, I do not envy you anymore. I've got to do that with Jess sometime. We'll do it. Anyway, enough about travel, jet lag, and New Zealand. Probably should introduce our guest.
Yes.
Yep. So she has a background in psychology and rehabilitation and over 25 years experience working in personal injury policy and practice. Her work has included a number of strategic reviews on claims and underwriting operations, including in-depth reviews of workers' compensation claims for psychological injury, which is why we wanted on today.
Yes.
She was co-author of the Green Paper on Mental Health and Insurance, published by the Actuaries Institute in 2017, and she's a senior consultant at Finity Consultants. Welcome to the podcast, Sue Freeman.
Hello, thank you very much. Thanks for that intro. And by the way, I can't nap either, Joelle.
Oh, good. Thank you.
We just soldier on with no sleep. I don't know why. Yeah.
I don't know how you guys do it, seriously.
Nor do I, but that's what we do. Yeah.
Yeah. But Sue, I saw you present at the Self-Insurers Association of Victoria conference recently. And I thought the research that you'd done around workers' compensation claims and some of the processes and investigations was really interesting. And I thought, hey, let's do a podcast on that. So thank you very much for, being willing to share again via this medium.
No, I'm happy to. No, that's great. And it was a great conference, wasn't it? There was a lot of enthusiasm in the room. It was good.
Yeah, it was really well organised and great presenters.
It's always good in a conference.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, Sue, before we get into the detailed questions, we have a couple of regular questions that we ask all of our guests. So the first one is, do you listen to any podcasts? And if so, what are your favourites?
Oh, well, that's unscripted, isn't it? I have been listening to the Flourish podcast over the last 6 months, and it's just been fabulous for me that I discovered Flourish, because it really started to coincide with my interests moving from, I guess, and we'll talk about this later, a focus on the management of workers' comp claims, particularly Psych is my area of interest, to a focus on preventing them. And that was a natural transition in my head. And at the same time, I was very much aware and reading widely on the mentally healthy workplace movement. And then the new regs came in, and suddenly it's the hot topic. And so, it's a natural progression from me from seeing what happens when everything's gone wrong and you've got really damaged people going through an absolutely brutal system, which makes them worse. It's a natural segue to start thinking about prevention. So, okay, what other podcasts? Can't think of any that are relevant, but they didn't warn me about that question, but it has been great for me. And I will say also, I'm not an HR professional, I'm a consultant. So I have to pay to join your podcasts. And I have actually done that. I hope
our
you're
webinars.
impressed.
Oh,
Yes,
the webinars, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. So I guess you've given us a little bit of insight into the next question, which is around your professional career and sort of, I think probably a similar pattern that we hear from other people who have been working in the response and sort of recovery side of things, going, well, hang on, if I work upstream, I might actually be able to prevent some of this harm that's happening rather than helping people recover from it. So can you tell us about your professional career, please?
Yes, well, I started out with an honours degree in psychology, and I guess I should start by saying I don't think any little girls and boys decide that they want to work in insurance, and that's their big ambition. Most of us who've worked in insurance found ourselves there through other pathways. So from psychology degree, I went into academic research for quite a while, and that was really interesting, sort of survey research, so behavioural stuff to do with various things, to do with utilisation of health services, not specifically mental health. Actually, I did a big study for the Ministry of Transport on commuter behaviour. So it was all kinds of things, but sort of behaviour and that statistical analysis of survey responses for quite a while. And then I went off and did a diploma in rehab counselling, wanting to get into something much more practical. And that was back in the time when that was a relatively new profession. You had to have a psych background to do it. And you ended up working in a multidisciplinary rehabilitation team. So some of those were for all kinds of things. Some were around mental health issues. Most were around accident and physical disabilities and problems. And some also went off and worked in, aged care homes, worked with children, variety of different things about rehabilitation, multidisciplinary rehab process. So I actually was lucky enough. It was kind of just the right time that in New South Wales, in the CTP, compulsory third-party space, it had previously been a monopoly, and it had just been opened up to privately underwritten insurers. And so all these insurers who had no idea about managing injuries at all had come onto the market and started writing these policies. So it was ripe for a consultancy. So I formed a consultancy where we'd just go to the various insurers, review their claims, provide injury management advice. And a lot of it, now insurers have these allied health background people within their ranks. But back then they didn't. They had claims people who didn't know much about injury management. And one of the big issues wasn't only that they weren't very good at talking to the injured people, it was also that they had no idea about providers. So a need to monitor what providers were offering, a need to, contain costs, or at least understand that it was goal-directed programs that were being offered. So it was really interesting because we came in and we did a lot of that individual casework, but over time we also educated claims staff and got them more across. And we developed procedures and processes for them because it was all brand new, which was pretty exciting. So I did that for quite a while. And then I moved to what was then the Motor Accidents Authority, but is now CIRA, which many of you would know as the regulator of personal injury compensation in New South Wales. So they regulate compulsory third party and workers' comp. And again, that was a scheme reform back then. It was a new model where they went into trying to reduce the amount of friction costs in the scheme, where people would generally go to court and argue out, build up a big dossier of evidence, and the evidence was how sick they were. So they had to, it sometimes takes 7 years, and they still have to maintain how absolutely very incapacitated they are. And then a judge, I'm sorry if I sound cynical, but a judge would decide whether physiotherapy was needed, stuff like that. It was hideous and it was costly. And, a lot of the costs went to the medico-legal doctors and the lawyers rather than to the injured person, and ridiculous outcomes were being seen. So this new model in compulsory third party in New South Wales, going back a while, introduced a different way of resolving medical disputes. So that was by recruiting a panel of experts, teaching them a bit about administrative law and procedural fairness and reasons for decision, which was quite good fun, teaching eminent orthopaedic specialists who like to write decisions that say, well, because in my experience, the case is this. And why? Because do you not know who I am? So we'd have to go, no, you need to spell out the reasons for your decision. You need to refer to evidence. This is actually administrative law. So then I went off and did a diploma in admin law. Have I talked enough about? So I did that for quite a long time, and I moved different roles. So I moved from the medical dispute resolution service, which we set up, more into the policy area, and then Motor Accidents Authority amalgamated and became CIRA across workers' comp as well. And there was a lot of work to do with, accreditation of providers, insurer processes, monitoring compliance with processes. One of the achievements was actually the first regime in Australia to introduce mandatory disclosure of legal costs in CTP. So lawyers actually had to advise the regulator what legal costs they were taking, which led to a change in regulations and capping of legal costs. So all round, it was trying to move towards a fairer and better system. But anyway, in 2016, I moved on from there and joined Finity Consultants, and that's where I am now.
That was a really interesting professional career where you've also been able to talk about the evolution of an industry at the same time as your career has sort of followed alongside that industry. So that was very interesting. Thank you.
But you can see why. Yeah, she's got 25 years of experience. Yeah. It's, but also, like you say, it's not just working with the evolution of the industry, but it's also been providing input to help the industry evolve, which is really amazing.
Well, that's right. And that's a message for the younger practitioners, isn't it? That it's kind of like I used to, when I was younger, think, why don't they? And how come they don't? But you are they. And, if you're in the right place at the right time, you can make a huge difference. And a lot of the things that you've been doing, along the way absolutely need to feed into the latest development, the latest policy development, the latest legislative change. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. And so currently you're working with Finity Consultants as a senior consultant. So tell us a bit about the work that you're doing there relating to psychological health and safety, if we move the topic into that direction.
Yeah, right. Well, Finity, most of you may not know, but they're actually an actuarial consultancy. So for the first time in my life, I'm working with, I have dealt with actuaries before, but I'm working with a firm that is almost exclusively actuarial, and they do all kinds of actuarial work for all kinds of insurance. So actually personal injury is really quite a small part of what they do, but they do have a number of workers' compensation and CTP clients. And I am not an actuary, and it's, a mystery to me. All that is mathematical modeling and prediction. Valuation of liabilities. So it's at that end, that sort of financial end of the insurance model. But Finity recognised and continues to recognise actually that there's some, that's a fairly limited lens. And when they're dealing with these clients, there are other issues. There are operational and strategic issues, and they probably need people with the more operational and strategic lens who understand the business and understand actually what happens on the floor. And so I certainly understand what happens on the floor. I've worked with claims staff and with providers, for years. So they have a management consulting team that sits beside the actuaries. And that's led me to, since 2016, we've done lots of small and large jobs that are around, often it's around trying to unpack the data to better understand what's going on in their portfolio, and specifically workers' comp. And so over the time, since I joined in 2016, that was, 2015 to 2021, I have written here, saw an 80% increase in psychological injury claims in workers' comp. So, it was right in my interest area. So psychological injury claims and what is going on became, something that a lot of insurers were trying to better understand. They were trying to unpack the data to see where they're hotspots, what's the demographics, and also what are the cost drivers, because they started realizing that psychological injury claims are far more costly and of longer duration. And then in practice, so much harder to return to work, which is why they're longer duration and cost so much. So a whole lot of stuff to do with benchmarking, looking at their claims management approaches. Then we developed a best practice model, and so then we were able to go, well, where do you sit compared to what we're saying is really the best practice approach for psych claims? And it's a dilemma because the workers' comp industry is very scattered. There are quite a lot of self-insurers, so their claims operations are quite small if they manage them in-house. And then some of them outsource them to third-party claims managers. So they're more or less connected with the employer and have more or less influence on the employer's responses. And I guess I'm getting ahead of myself and thinking the more I looked at psychological claims, the more I was worried about the employer's response to what is a distressed worker and a distressed employee. And, the workers' comp system kicks in, and we could talk about that later if you like. But so I suppose at Finity, it's taken me all around on that sort of work. And Finity also has expanded into AI, and it's got some software developers and tech people. So we were able to develop a little user-friendly sort of audit tool that people self-evaluate their case management specific to psych, identify areas of weakness, monitor improvements. So stuff like that. It's been quite good fun.
So your customers are mainly insurers, are they then?
Yep. I guess we've done a couple of jobs for providers who are also wanting, it's mainly data analytics, and I sit, I'm not a data scientist, so I work with data scientists, and often it's that ground floor sort of understanding of the business operations that informs the way they break things down. Yeah.
Yeah. No, really interesting.
Mm.
So we would like to talk about the research you've conducted into the nature of psychological injury claims in workers' compensation. Can you tell us a little bit about what prompted you to undertake that research?
Yes, well, look, it was just a brilliant opportunity because, as I say, mostly we were looking at data and trying to unpack the data to better understand. But this particular client had seen a doubling in the incidence of psychological injury claims across their organisation, and it was a big organisation with metropolitan and regional branches across New South Wales. And so given that rise, and actually, the same sort of rise was happening nationally, but they were sort of ahead of the game going, what is going on in our organisation? So what they commissioned us to do is actually do a deep dive review into the circumstances that led to the claim and the nature of the claim and trying to uncover root causes. So that was the first time that we'd had the opportunity to do that. So I don't know if your audience is familiar with what workers' comp claim files look like, but what that involved actually we did some clever work to select a good sample, and then we really spent hours on each claim, and we read every single file note because claim staff have to file note every conversation with every person. And we also read the person's description of what happened to them. And then very often with psych claims, they were investigated, and an investigator would have gone out and interviewed the supervisor and the worker and the co-workers and witnesses to the incident and so on. So there's a volume of stuff to read, and we read it all, and we tried to develop a classification system into what are we seeing, what were the triggers, what was the nature of each one. And we weren't necessarily expecting the results that we got. So one of the surprise findings is that a disproportionate number of these claims in this organisation were alleging bullying and harassment, more than you would expect based on national stats. Mm. But you know what? Then when we looked at it again, we went, well, when the circumstances they describe, many of them, dare I say more than half of them, would not meet safe work definitions of bullying or harassment, which is repeated targeted behaviour. So, I'm going to call out anybody that looks at workers' comp stats, be cautious, because what the person wrote on the form is what it gets classified as. And, also they write down, I've got severe depression. Okay, they might have a medical evaluation that says, no, you're not suffering from severe depression. Does anyone ever go back and change the coding? No. So that stays as a bullying and harassment claim, although it wasn't established that it was, resulting in severe depression, although it didn't. So the stats, what a great learning for us as data scientists, that the stats aren't actually telling you what's going on. Yeah, but another finding...
it's the data's only as good as the input, right?
Well, that's right. And when more information comes in, I mean, it's their main purpose is trying to manage the claim so that they're not going to go back and reclassify. But, I often wish they would. But another key finding which fed my interest in prevention is that very often these claims, when you read all the information, you could see that they hadn't come out of thin air. They'd had a long background. A person had been very upset, angry, disgruntled for a long time. In I think the majority of cases, a significant number of cases, and in their words, they had been calling it out and feeling that there was no way to be heard and that they were ignored or that the problems that they were reporting were persisting. And a disproportionate number of these claims came from people who had lodged a complaint or a grievance. And the person who lodged the complaint ended up being psychologically unwell and off work because of the lack of response, the lack of closure, the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of being told that there'd been an outcome. And I found it frustrating because sometimes you could see that there had been an outcome. And with bullying claims, there had been an outcome, but the processes that are adopted and HR professionals will recognise this. I know there's confidentiality issues and so on, but the process were adopted didn't include closing the loop with the complainant and didn't include, as I could see, thanking the complainant very much for bringing up an issue. So one of my big hopes is in this new environment with its new regulatory structure, organisations should start going, thank you so much for letting us know about these problems. But the attitude of employers in the main was disappointingly very negative. And so we saw things like they made contact with people who'd gone off on workers' comp for psych injury far less often than if you'd broken your leg. They tended to say this was a problem employee. They tended not to offer a graded return to work far less often than they did for physical injury. So the very people that were feeling the most isolated and vulnerable were the ones who got the least support from employers. And the other thing I felt strongly about is there doesn't seem to be this, like I think, and I'm not a work health and safety professional or an HR professional, but so I think if someone tripped on a trip hazard and injured themselves, that would find its way to the WHS team and someone would look at that trip hazard and make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone else. I didn't see that kind of link with the psych claims. I didn't see someone going, we understand our grievance process is so brutal, it's driving people to their GP. And people would go to their GP and go, I don't know what's the matter with me. I can't sleep. I'm so angry. And the GP would go, work-related mental illness. And there you go. You've medicalised what was often an industrial relations issue. And worst thing that could happen for the poor people involved. Not all of them. Some of them were genuine bullying claims. Another finding that I want to share with you, which I hadn't expected, but when I shared it with the employer, they went, yeah, of course. A very disproportionate number of people who lodged psychological injury claims had known vulnerabilities. So we invented this category on the run because we kept seeing it, not just a pre-existing psych condition, although a lot of people had a pre-existing psych condition that the employer knew about and was recorded on their HR file and the supervisor knew about. But other vulnerabilities, they had disabled child, they were looking after elderly parents, but recent marriage breakdown, financial distress, vulnerable, known to be vulnerable. And we knew because it was on the notes. So the vulnerable people who had known vulnerabilities were far more likely to lodge these claims. And it makes sense because they're feeling less resilient. And So when you start thinking about prevention, you start thinking about, you actually know about a number of employees who are having a pretty rough time at the moment. Does that in any way affect the way that you manage them? No. Maybe it should. Maybe there's a more aware way to manage people who are going through a difficult time. And it came down to a lot of, poor management practice. Really, the most common cause that you could classify for these workers' comp claims were poor management practice, long-standing acceptance of really poor workplace behaviour, the way people spoke to each other, the way the team operated, the way the manager dealt with individuals, long-standing causing stress. And it's really sad. I think I said this at the conference, Jason. I saw one where the person said, look, I've lodged this claim on behalf of all of us. And I'm kind of like, it's terrible because that's not how workers' comp works. You're now going to be put through the ringer. It's not going to result in change for your team. The organisation hasn't recognised this as an industrial relations issue. They're now seeing it as a psychological injury for you. You are flawed. It's a tragedy. And so they think they'll get an outcome by lodging a workers' comp claim, and that's absolutely not going to happen. But maybe it should. Maybe there should be a better link between workers' comp claims and work health and safety. Yeah. Anyway, so interesting and sad, I think a few people perceive with this massive increase in claims, they're not genuine, these snowflakes are trying to, they just want a holiday. They just want to go off on workers' comp for a few weeks. I really saw that so rarely. We saw personal vendettas. We saw really a minority, like, I'm going to make the employer pay for this, and it's seen as a weapon. And often, dare I say, people were encouraged to take that path by union reps. But the vast majority were not. They were just people who were really hurting and going, I've put up with this so long and I just can't do it anymore. Yeah. So I feel a lot for employers to learn by looking at their workers' comp claims experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so much to unpack from that.
I mean, I think, when you're talking about industrial relations issues there, I think what we're really talking about is a failure of organisational justice, as a broad category, and that will actually lead to psychological injury if it's not addressed. So, while it's not a bullying or harassment scenario necessarily, it is still certainly a failure of the organisation to manage these conditions that we know do contribute to mental health outcomes for individuals or teams.
Absolutely, yes, I agree.
And I think that I make this analogy fairly often about, if somebody was out playing rugby on the weekend and pulled their shoulder and their job was, doing night fill at a warehouse or something like that, you wouldn't just say, oh, you've got a sore shoulder. Well, that's not work related. So off you go and carry on doing your job, lifting things onto the shelves using that injured shoulder. We would actually give them light duties or, organise something else for them to be doing while that shoulder injury is healing, regardless of whether or not it was caused by work. And, we really need to upskill line leaders in actually being able to say, okay, this is, you're having some struggles outside of work at the moment. You're going through a divorce, bereavement, whatever that might be. You don't have the same capacity, the same mental capacity that you would normally have for work. So what can we reduce in your workload so that you can continue to work? So we're kind of doing the equivalent of light duties, but we're doing it in terms of the mental load rather than the physical load.
Absolutely. And yet the tragedy is because what we've got is a workers' compensation model that was designed for physical injuries, forcing psych injuries, which are completely different, into that model. So one of the first things they have to do is assess liability. So they have to go, so was this caused by work? And I'm thinking, okay, people spend 65, 70% of their life at work. Oh, but you had a pre-existing problem, therefore it's not us. And I'm like, so that's just tragic. 1/5 of your workforce will have a mental health problem every year, probably more. So, and at different times, people will cycle in and out of periods of more or less vulnerability. So you can't, as an employer, avoid it. But the workers' comp model tries to go, well, where's the evidence that work caused this? And using your analogy, Jodie, I mean, if you've had shoulder surgery before for some other reason, and then doing the night fill, you've exacerbated it, they go, oh, fine, okay, you had a vulnerable shoulder. and you've exacerbated it. Light duties, but maybe on reflection, you're not really suited to night fill. We might give you something that's a bit lighter because you've got a dicky shoulder. Do we use the same approach in psych? Absolutely. We go shape up, toughen up, come back to the same job, the same team, the same duties that made you sick. And don't imagine that claiming workers' comp is going to be an easy way for you to move to a nicer area of the business because they resist it. The employers were going, oh my God, if we did that, everyone would claim. And I've said to them, where's the evidence of that? Most people with a mental health problem in the workplace do not claim. The stats are very clear. What is it? I had those stats at the conference, didn't I? It was something like 1 in 200 people who are mentally unwell and employed make a claim. Most of them soldier on because people don't want to make a workers' comp claim unless, they really can't work. So anyway, one thing I do want to say, though, because it might not be the right time, but I don't want to forget, is an insight I got from another conference, which was more to do with psychosocial risk assessment, where it said that although the national stats indicate increasing proportion of psych claims are bullying and harassment, the experience of the people in that conference was that the majority of the biggest risk and the majority of psychological unwellness that they were seeing was burnout, not bullying and harassment. And I went, aha. So I do think people who are suffering burnout don't lodge a workers' comp claim because tragically what they do is blame themselves. And what they do is they leave. They go, I just can't hack it anymore. I'm just so exhausted. I'm not the right person. I'm going to quit and take a different type of job. So they don't show up in workers' comp. Yeah.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode. Yeah, like you say, workers' comp statistics are a pretty blunt instrument. We know a lot of people that will soldier on whilst mentally unwell, or they'll just turn over and it won't ever make it to a compensation claim.
Absolutely, yep. So I suppose if my talk should have been, but I haven't had the opportunity to do a study of exit interviews, I think the wisdom comes from workers' comp claims and exit interviews. And what do organisations do with the information they get from exit interviews? I'd love to know. Do the work health and safety team get to know the things that are raised when people are leaving?
Yeah, I mean, there's all these different sources of data on psychosocial hazards, right, that could be used, whether it's EAP data, whether it's information from peer supporters, exit interview data, and that could all feed into a risk assessment or hazard identification that should be shared with the workplace health and safety team, you would think. But
you would hope.
Yeah, so there's a couple other things while I remember, because you unpack so much from your research, it's like so rich in findings, and a lot of that just really... from our own observations, it's really reinforcing of things that we've seen. But one of the things that was interesting was around not closing the loop with injured people, going, well, what has actually happened, or if people have made a complaint around bullying and harassment, that will get dealt with, but then it doesn't actually circle back to what have the changes been to prevent this from happening again, right, with it. And that's that whole... companies want people to speak up and report, whether it's a physical hazard or a psychological hazard. And we see this big, push at the moment around psychological safety. If we've got a psychologically safe workplace, then people will speak up when there's a psychosocial hazard. But if people don't feel like they're being heard because we haven't taken the time to close the loop and go, well, we heard you and this is what we did, then that's actually going to defeat any efforts that you're putting in to try and create psychological safety in the first place, right?
I couldn't agree more, yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, really interesting what you're saying there, because that's what we're seeing all the time. It's like, we want a psychologically safe workplace. Speak up if you see a hazard, but then, people don't hear if there's any changes. The other thing that was really interesting, which we're seeing as well, is when someone does make an injury claim, it's treated as an individual problem rather than a symptom of a systemic issue. So we know when if someone has an injury in the workplace, then we should do a hazard assessment of the work environment to make sure that no other workers are at risk of suffering the same injury, right?
Absolutely.
But we don't do that with psychological injuries, like you say. We focus on the individual. This was a failure of the individual, not a failure of the system. And so therefore we miss out on so many learning opportunities to go, well, how do we actually drive systemic improvements to prevent the rest of the population of workers here who are doing the same sort of work in the same conditions from suffering the same fate as this poor individual.
Absolutely. And, really, it's, again, I go back to we're suffering under the wrong model, a model that works for physical injury. So, when you think about rehabilitation providers who are then brought in to assist the injured person to get their head around returning to work in the same place. And generally speaking, it will be return to work in the same exact place that you were when you were sick. And so you're right, the rehab providers don't then start working with the organisation about supporting workers generally and about where things go wrong and about rules of engagement and the way that we treat each other. That's not their gig. That they're not paid to do that. And in fact, insurers don't encourage them to do that. It's very much this mythology that what you've got to do is improve the resilience of the individual so that they can go back to a toxic workplace and not get sick. And I'm kind of like, when you say it that way, that's crazy. And what actually really, to be fair, and some of your audience will know, because if they work in this area, that what really often happens these days is that pretty early on, a decision is made that return to work with the same team and the same employer is just not going to work. And so they go, right, so, they don't ever tell a worker, but there's counselling and working with the worker to go, is in fact your goal to find a role and, what type of role, whatever, with someone new? Do you need to start somewhere else? But of course, the success rate for that. So I will say that that's quite realistic sometimes, but I guess the only reason it's realistic is because it's not part of the gig to say, right, the employer has to change. It's always the person's fault. Yeah. It's a long way from being perfect. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I guess coming out of that research then, what would you say are the implications for prevention of psychological injury claims and even sort of upstream mitigating psychosocial risks as well?
Well, I think it made me think that there needs to be another way, and this fits so much now into this whole approach to psychosocial risk assessment. There needs to be another way for people to raise concerns and be heard, and feel that action can be taken outside of the workers' comp system. So I think I said some people were saying, well, I didn't know what else. It's the last resort because there's nowhere else to go. I've tried to raise it with HR. I've tried to raise it with my boss. Nowhere else to go, and now I'm sick. So why is there nowhere else to go? And possibly as part now of the exercise of psychosocial risk assessment, this opens the door, doesn't it, for an ongoing method and process for people to raise issues, as you said, Jason, just like they do for physical risks, about themselves, about their colleagues, and actually have a system that's completely outside the workers' comp system, which alerts management. But the important thing is it also is transparent. So people know that they've been heard and that action is being taken. And it's part of that communication with workers around psychosocial risk assessment, I think, isn't it? To go, we'll be really transparent, but some things are going to take quite a while to mitigate. So we're really grateful and we've heard, and some of these things are quite problematic. So it's going to take us some time, but we're going to keep you informed. I just feel like that honestly could have avoided a lot of the claims that I saw, is to go, well, I've had a chance and I trust them. I believe them that they will look at it. There's a great deal of cynicism out there, so building that trust is going to be critical. And I suppose the other key implication for prevention was really supporting and training and mentoring direct supervisors and middle managers, because it's really difficult, and often they're under they're the meat in the sandwich, aren't they? They may be managing difficult people, and they're also managing pressure from above, and nobody's perfect. And maybe they don't make allowance for the individual differences of the people in the team because they don't really know how to, and they're really busy. So I think a lot more support. And I said to the organisation that I did this work for, I'm not talking about, a seminar from a psychologist about mental health awareness. I'm talking about, an afternoon a month for the next 6 months, role playing, setting up buddy systems, having a way that you can seek expert advice. Bring your EAP providers in to advise managers on dealing with difficult situations, which is something they offer, but managers never use. Can HR provide more support? Because very often it is, it's the key is in responding to someone who's in distress, whether you hear them or whether you make it worse. And a really good comprehensive psychosocial risk assessment will drag that out. I think it will start to, bring those things to the front. And then mitigating them, I think, is very much what I learned from this research. It's very much about people knowing that they've been heard, people being consulted about what the mitigations might be. And the sort of things that I saw, it is actually believing that an organisation has zero tolerance for poor workplace behaviour, actually believing that there really is, that it will not be tolerated. And if they can demonstrate that over time, then they'll build trust, Yeah,
and I think, to build on what you were saying there around that upskilling of frontline leaders, the other aspect of that is that you need good policy from the HR side of things as well that isn't overly prescriptive, that actually allows, enables and empowers line leaders to be able to make reasonable adjustments for their teams in relation to things like workload or other exposures in the workplace that are potentially causing harm. So it's not just about telling the line leaders how to do it. You actually need the sort of the management systems and structures in place to support and empower them to do that as well.
That was the exact same response I had. I was doing a panel in New Zealand recently, and someone was trying to, we're talking about that thing that we often observe where leaders are promoted into leadership positions because of their technical competence, and they might not necessarily be the greatest leader. And so the panel moderator was trying to push me into a position of, we need to, train leaders in how to do this. And I'm like, you can do all the training that you want, but if you don't have the management systems that support the leader to make these decisions and make these, these changes in work design, for example, then they're going to be hamstrung. Like, it's going to be such a waste. You can't train your way out of it. You need to have the systems in place. So
that's right. Absolutely.
So Joelle, I concur.
Thank you.
I suppose one other thing I'll say in the workers' comp system is, for years now, we've had this requirement that an organisation has to have a return to work coordinator, and they've done some training, and their role is to help prescribe suitable duties and graded return to work programs, and to be the person in the organisation that sort of negotiates and explains it to the manager and goes, so here's the return to work plan, so many hours a day and then increasing to so many hours a day. So I'm going to say the poor things. Some of them I'm sure are brilliant, but the organisation I was in, some of them were so junior, really junior people, very little addition. They had another job and they were doing this on the side for very little additional pay. They really didn't have any background that would help them understand what a graded return to work for someone with psychological injury might look like. And the trouble is, nor do GPs. And GPs are the gatekeeper. And so what I found, people are certified unfit for so much longer, which is the worst thing that could happen. And so they're isolated from the workplace and no one calls them because everyone's scared. No one knows how to prescribe a return to work program that's not going to exacerbate. And the reason is, you've pinpointed it before, Jacob, because no one's dealing with the issues in the workplace that, or maybe I shouldn't say no one is, but, with variable effectiveness. So there seems to be this fear and everyone treading on eggshells. Employers said, look, I didn't want to ring them every week because I don't want to harass them because, they're fragile. And I'm like, so what's happened is you haven't rung them ever. They've been off work for 4 months and they've never heard from you. And the doctor says, well, I wouldn't want to certify them fit for even a couple of hours a day or just attend team meetings because I don't know. And I'm like, well, then who's going to find out? because you get stuck in this place. It's not. So I guess the point I'm making is this model and return to work coordinators also need to be better equipped to support return to work efforts in a more intelligent way. And one thing I see that doesn't happen enough is that rehabilitation providers and claims managers within the insurance companies should be liaising with the treating psychologist, who is the one who can probably give you a fair idea of what would be a good idea to try. The treating psychologist can help write the return to work plan and counsel the worker on how to approach it. But that very seldom happens. Everyone's scared to talk to anyone else. So there you go.
Mm. So how do you believe organisations could better tailor their mentally healthy workplace strategies with all this in mind that we've talked about today?
Look, certainly I think a comprehensive risk assessment is the key, because it's going to pull out things that you may not have expected and may not know. But I think that there is a wealth of information in the workers' comp claims, and particularly if you've been seeing an increase. And I think for an organisation as part of their risk assessment, it'd be worth unpacking. Are there psych claims coming from a particular area? Have they changed over time? What's the demographic? And if they are seeing some trends that aren't pretty, which many of them will because the national stats are dreadful, it's worth a deep dive to actually go in and have a look at the circumstances. And I think one of the things it'll do is give you some learnings about response to people in psychological distress. And the objective is that they don't need to lodge a workers' comp claim. Hopefully they can raise their issues and we can support someone who's in psychological distress without being part of the workers' comp system. Yeah. So
yeah, that was one of your findings, wasn't it, Sue, that, people found their way into the workers' compensation system because they felt there's no other way to enact change. If they go through a risk management cycle, and assess and address the psychosocial hazards that are identified, then people are going to see, there is actually, the company is interested in this, they are doing something, and hopefully it prevents a lot of claims that didn't need to happen.
Well, as part of the mitigation, perhaps it becomes someone's role, or there are a group of people who have the role of being sort of peer support, mental health people, within the organisation that you can go to raise things confidentially if you don't want to raise them with your direct manager. And that layer, they used to do it with equal opportunity, didn't they, and anti-discrimination. That layer that's separate from the management structure, it can work well, providing, that there's a way for that layer of peer support people maybe to raise it then with the work health and safety team. But that alone would mitigate. Yeah.
You've given me a great idea, Sue, because by the time this episode airs, we would have launched our professional practice program aimed at people and safety professionals to upskill them in how to do psychosocial risk management, right?
Great.
But we have created a feature a while ago within our Flourish DX platform to support the management of a peer support program, so that we can start to get data back from peer supporters around, why are people having to access and that sort of thing. So similar to EAP data, we're getting some more data around people's experiences, which are leading them to crisis or, feeling distressed. And so, if there was a peer support program that also taught peer supporters, I guess, about the psychosocial work factors and how to classify them properly so that we're feeding data up, outside of a formal psychosocial risk assessment process, it's another way of getting that data. So, you give me an idea, so I'm going to chat with Joel about it when we're off air.
That's great. And another thing is, I've gone on trouble with EAP. EAP is very great, and organisations will go, look, we've got an increase in the use of EAP, so that's a good thing. And I'm like, or is it a bad thing? I don't know, because you don't get any information back from EAP about what is actually going on. So as part of your mitigation, you may negotiate with EAP or someone else that, with the consent of the person, discussion about the issue, support for the worker, but with the proviso that issues around the workplace itself will be anonymously fed back at the end of 6 months. It won't be tied to you particularly, but it's part of our WHS that when people are using the EAP and they're bringing up problems that are, the wrong culture, the wrong climate, not what we want in our organisation, we need to be able to get that information back. And there are a few organisations that are doing that as a pre-claim program. So they go, if you're feeling distressed and you're thinking about lodging workers' comp, here's where you go with our pre-claim program. We're going to give you support. We're going to give you some extra time off. We're going to discuss as a group what needs to be done to improve the situation before you ever lodge a claim. And they're harnessing their EAP to do that. I think that's another great idea.
So what are your thoughts on the new regulatory framework for this sort of risk management approach when we're talking about psychosocial harm? Do you think that this is likely to improve the situation for workers?
I do. I guess I've got one thought that goes, so we've said, and I don't in any way mean to criticise the wonderful work that Flourish has done, but I guess the best approach we've said is basically it's the same approach as it is for physical, risk assessment, mitigation, monitoring. And I'm thinking, well, it is, but it's really different, but within this framework. So and we are within this framework. We've got a workers' comp system that was designed for physical injury, and we've got a risk assessment system that's designed for physical risk. So within this system, which is where we belong at the moment, I'm thinking perhaps in the future, in a new world, there will be a different framework altogether for mental health. Okay, so having said that, I think it's really good. And initially I thought it's quite a big ask. And so I suppose the danger is when organisations just do the minimum, to tick the box, to comply or think they've complied by doing something or other and not really consulting and not really mitigating, then I think that will do more harm than good. And Flourish says the same all the time, that, that's then a betrayal of trust. You'll get even more cynicism. If you then start trying to do it properly, no one will trust you. So and I'm saying the same to my clients now, this is the opportunity to get it right, but it really means genuine commitment. Because over time, building trust, you get, the benefits are well known. You are more productive, more efficient, less turnover, happier, everything. So yes, I think it's a wonderful thing, and I think it will improve things for workers, but there needs to perhaps be as much support and advice to organisations as possible to encourage them to make that real genuine commitment to it, which a lot of what Flourish does is encouraging exactly that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's I think a pragmatic choice to frame this within existing work health and safety frameworks, because that's what people are already familiar with. And so if we can say, here's how this is very much like something that you're already doing, it's less scary and it's seen as more achievable. And I sort of think about, when cars were first invented and they were sharing the road with horses, and they would actually put a fake horse head on the front of the car so that it would be less scary for the horses and for the people on the roads and that sort of thing. So it looked a little bit more familiar to them, and they could sort of see, oh, this is sort of doing the same kind of thing as the horse does, but it's just a little bit different. And now obviously we don't have horse heads on the front of cars anymore, because people have adjusted and adapted, and now cars are doing all sorts of things that horses could never do. So
and it'd freak people out.
It would be quite terrifying now to look at a car that had a horse head mounted on the front of it.
No, but it's a good analogy. That's right. I mean, and because it is within existing frameworks, it will happen. So of course, I mean, that's pragmatic. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing, I guess, to circle back to that is, yes, we do focus a lot on the prevent harm part of the integrated model, but the integrated model, which underpins the work that we do, is really about tackling mental health at a population level from three different angles. It's supporting ill health, it's preventing harm, and it's also promoting flourishing, or promoting the positive aspects of work. So really, that's the model that we need. It's just the pragmatic choice, as Joelle puts it, is this is an existing system and it's regulated, so you have to do this. And it's a bit that companies haven't been doing. Let's face it, They've been doing a lot of wellbeing washing, and they've been doing a lot of tertiary intervention, but they haven't been doing the bit which is looking at the modifiable aspects of work that have the potential to cause harm and making sure that they don't injure people.
Absolutely. Yep. So I think it's a very positive direction, and the fact that it's regulated and it's mandatory is really positive. And a lot of organisations are going to need a lot of help and support to understand it and to do it well. So that's why it's good that you guys are around.
Yeah. And Sue, fantastic that you're around, and amazing research. It's great to work within a multidisciplinary team, isn't it? You know, being able to work with actuaries who bring this kind of data analytics to the fore. It's
It is. It's powerful.
really,
yeah.
really interesting. Yeah.
Mm.
So, it has been a fascinating conversation. But before we leave, there's a question that we like to ask all of our guests, and that is, looking into your crystal ball, if you're to imagine the future of workplace mental health, what would it look like?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I like to think that more and more young people themselves will drive employers to improve their offering. That more and more it'll be like, as it is already a bit, why would I want to work for you? And so employers will have as a top priority that they create a nurturing and supportive environment, and they want to hold on to the expertise that they've got. So it's one of their top priorities is how to do that and how to evolve with their evolving workplace, how to be nurturing and supportive to the different demographics that will be there and the changes in roles that are going to be happening. So I'd like to think that this is the start of a journey that, it'll be a competitive environment, and employers will more and more be needing to show why would I come and work for you? What is it that you're offering me? Mm.
Yeah, it's going to be a non-negotiable, right? In the future I also agree.
Yeah, and it's a significant part of the EVP already.
Yeah.
We know that it's generally the second most important thing for people after salary when they're considering a job offer. So
yeah, but if you've done any looking around lately, you get this kind of like motherhood blurb with lots of pretty pictures about, lunchtime walks and access to gyms and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about,
Yeah.
And in fact, the fact that you've sent me that as if that's, cutting edge makes me feel kind of very negative. If you think that's what it's about, that's not what it's about. I wanted to see some statements that were really meaningful about the way in which you engage with your staff and learn from them, the way that you always strive to be a better culture. And that's not what they're saying. Again, it's just that ticker box.
Yeah, and that's, I think, part of the, employees becoming more savvy in the types of questions that they're asking during interview as well.
Or the reverse interview. Let me talk to some of your employees, please. Yeah.
Yes, I would like 3 references, please. Yeah.
That'd be so good. Yeah.
Like that idea.
So do you have any words of advice for listeners who want to work in the field of psychological health and safety?
Oh, well, just encouragement. I think this is such an exciting time to be in that field. And a lot, you may have come from diverse backgrounds, but the things, that you've probably spent time doing, like I found, will feed into this new movement now, which is growing in strength and importance. So I think just stay with it, and don't ever imagine that your opinions and the things you bring from your own experience in the workplace aren't important and relevant, because I think, another thing that we say all the time is the diversity of opinion into this space is what's going to give it its strength. So people will come from a variety of backgrounds into this area. And I think there's so much, to be achieved. It's very exciting. So stay with it.
Wonderful words of advice. Thank you.
So, Sue, it has been a fascinating conversation. You didn't disappoint. Like I said, your presentation at the conference was fantastic. And so thank you so much for, agreeing to come on the podcast and sharing again with our listeners.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks.
And can people find your research anywhere?
Well, the actual findings are a bit confidential to the client, but contact me through the Finity website, and I can provide information about the process. And of course, we're available to help organisations that want to do something similar to explore the learnings that they can get from their own data. So, the specific findings are confidential to the client, but the overview I can certainly provide. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and are you active on LinkedIn as well, Sue?
Yeah, not as much as I should be, but I'm there. Yeah, you can find me there, and Finity website also. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. All right, thanks, Sue. And so when you're on LinkedIn, you'll also find that we will put some snippets of this conversation, like we do with all of the guests that we have on the Flourish TX LinkedIn page.
Excellent.
You'll also find the full video, like all of our other videos, on the Flourish TX YouTube page. And feel free to continue the conversation on LinkedIn with Joelle, myself, and Sue. But thanks, everyone, and we will catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychhealthandsafety.com.